So we apologize for the connection problems we're having. I'm going to continue and try to pick up where I left off, and we'll have to cut down the talk slightly because of the time remaining. We mentioned before we got disconnected that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned the success, the true meaning of success, and being successful is the one who is saved from the fire due to his own sins and his own disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and is admitted into al-Jannah, paradise, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَمَنْ زُحْزِحَ عَنِ النَّارِ وَأُدْخِلَ الْجَنَّةَ فَقَدْ فَازَ. Whoever is saved from the fire and admitted into paradise, then he is the one who has succeeded, or he is the one who has been successful. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in many places in the Quran told us his promise that he will admit the believing men and women into Jannah, into paradise. And so he linked success and admission into paradise with having correct iman, faith and belief, which includes practicing the religion of Islam and putting into practice all those things that iman, that a person's faith necessitates or requires of him or her. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, for example, in Surah At-Tawbah, وَعَدَ اللَّهُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ جَنَّاتٍ تَجْرِي مِنْ تَحْتِهَا الْأَنْهَارُ خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا وَمَسَاكِنَ طَيِّبَةً فِي جَنَّاتِ عَدْنٍ وَرِضْوَانٌ مِّنَ اللَّهِ أَكْبَرُ ذَلِكَ هُوَ الْفَوْزُ الْعَظِيمُ. Allah has promised the believing men and women gardens, jannat, beneath which rivers flow, wherein they will abide, they will live forever, and pleasant dwellings in gardens of perpetual residence. But the pleasure of Allah, the ridwan of Allah, is greatest. It is that which is the great attainment or the great achievement. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, ليدخل المؤمنين والمؤمنات جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها ويكفر عنهم سيئاتهم وكان ذلك عند الله فوزا عظيما. And that He, Allah, may admit the believing men and the believing women to gardens beneath which rivers flow, to abide therein forever, and remove from them their sins. And Allah is always, and Allah has always considered this, or Allah always sees this as the great achievement. Meaning with Allah, this is the great achievement or a great success, and that is to be admitted into Al-Jannah. So, if we want to consider what it means to be a successful sister, a successful Muslim woman, we have to consider what success really means. Is it really a matter of these two qualities that I was mentioning, that are the general qualities for everyone to be successful, and that is to have correct iman and to have righteous action, to have the correct beliefs, attitudes and feelings towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to believe everything that a person has been told to believe in as true in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and in the sunnah of His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and to follow those deeds or follow those beliefs with righteous actions, with the correct actions involving obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and staying away from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden, to put into practice what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us in terms of His worship, to worship Him alone, and to worship Him correctly according to the revelation that He revealed through His Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and to stay away from those things that we have been forbidden and we have been warned about, in his book, the book of Allah, and in the sunnah of his messenger, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and to deal with the creation of Allah, to deal with others, and to interact with them in accordance with the Sharia, the law, and the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is also part of doing the righteous deeds and putting Iman into practice. So because of the problems we've had with connection, I'm going to go straight into some of those qualities that have been that the successful people have been described within the Quran. And of course there are many. We have to understand that we can't do justice to a subject or a topic connected with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us in the Quran. We can't really do full justice to it in a small amount of time, because the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all about the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it is the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He revealed to His messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. But we can say that we can summarize the qualities that everyone should have, men and women, to be successful, that they need to have this Iman, correct Iman, and righteous actions, and all of the things that are required to have correct Iman and to have correct actions. The first of them is to have correct knowledge, to have knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and of His religion and of His Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And it is required for every Muslim, man or woman, to have a sufficient amount of knowledge about their Lord and about what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed through His messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, in order to have correct Iman and in order to have correct actions. So this is a requirement. And that is why the scholars of Islam have mentioned a very important principle, and that is the principle as stated by one of the great scholars, al-ilmu qabla al-qawli wal-amal. And in fact, Imam al-Bukhari, the famous scholar of hadith, mentioned this as a title and as a principle. Knowledge comes before speech and action. A person must have a sufficient amount of knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the deen of Allah before he or she speaks and acts, such that when a person does speak and when a person does act, they will be speaking or they will be behaving in accordance with what pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, based upon sound knowledge of what pleases Allah and what angers Allah, what we should stay away from. Some of those specific passages in the Quran that describe the believing men and women, as you will know, in the Quran we have there are a number of different ways in which the Quran addresses people, calling them to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, calling them to the obedience of Allah. So in some places in the Quran there is a general address and call to the whole of mankind. Ya ayyuhan nas. For example, the first command, the first order in the Quran, which is the order to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, is addressed to the whole of mankind, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Ya ayyuhan nas, O mankind, u'budu rabbakum alladhi khalaqakum. O mankind, worship Allah alone, who created you and those before you. And then some proofs, some of the signs for people, for mankind in general, that they should only worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, they should worship Him alone, these are mentioned. This is the first command in the Quran. And throughout the Quran you have this form of nas. O mankind, O people. So this includes everyone, and is a core invitation to them to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to worship Allah alone. In some places in the Quran, in many places in the Quran, the believers, the mu'minun, those who have accepted the truth and who believe in Allah and believe in everything they're supposed to believe in the messenger, they believe in the hereafter, those people have been addressed specifically in a number of places in the Quran. So you find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses in the Quran people, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe. For us Muslims, this is these are very important, there is a certain degree of concentration, importance we need to give whenever we hear or whenever we read in the Quran these types of verses, this address. Because if we regard ourselves as people who believe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then this address is directed towards us. And as some of the Sahaba Ridwanullahi alayhim said, whenever you hear a verse in the Quran that says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, you should listen carefully. You should listen carefully, because either it is something that Allah is commanding you to do, or it's something that Allah is telling you to stay away from. And one of the benefits about understanding the Quran, and something which we can all take away with us and appreciate whenever we read the Quran, is whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses the believers by this, with this way, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, we need to understand, as the scholars have explained, that this links whatever comes afterwards in those verses, whether it's a command about something that we're supposed to do, or it's a prohibition about something we're supposed to stay away from. Whatever is mentioned after that address is linked to a person's iman. And so there are two things we understand from that. The first is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is addressing the believers, saying, because of your iman, because you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you accept the truth, you should put this thing into practice, or you should do what you've been told to do here, or stay away from what you have been told to stay away from. And secondly, it is a call for us to realize that having faith, having iman in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala necessitates certain things. If a person has true iman, then that must bring about certain actions, it must bring about certain change in a person's behavior and in a person's lifestyle. So when he or she acts, they do things that are in accordance with the obedience of Allah. And that iman, that faith that a person has, that belief about the truth, also means, or it makes a person, or it should make a person stay away from the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told to stay away from. So as Shaykh As-Sa'di rahimahullah, the famous scholar of Tafsir, said, it's as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, if you are a believer, if you truly believe, then do such and such thing, the thing that is mentioned in this verse, or in this passage of the Quran. And if you really are a believer, then you need to stay away from the thing that you're being forbidden in this verse or in this passage of the Quran. So this is the type of meaning and understanding we should gain whenever we read or we hear Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. Another way of describing or addressing people in the Quran is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes, without directly addressing a group of people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the qualities of the believers. And in this respect, as a rule, we know that when the believers are described in the Quran, this includes both men and women, unless there is a proof, there is specific proof, there is a specific proof, either in the context of the verses or through the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, through the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which explains the Quran, to show that this particular command or prohibition is specific to the men of this ummah or to the women of this ummah. Otherwise, the general rule is, when believers are addressed, "O you who believe," and when believers and righteous people are described, this refers to both men and women. So, in terms of the obligation upon us all to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and believe in the hereafter, to accept the truth and to act upon the truth, to put it into practice in our lives, all of this ummah, all of the believers, men and women, are the same in this regard, and they have the same obligation and the same promise of success and the same promise of being forgiven for their shortcomings and their mistakes, and being admitted into paradise and saved from the fire. However, in other places in the Quran, there is also an emphasis given with regards to men and with regards to women. In some places, believing men and women are mentioned alongside each other in the verses of the Quran. And in some places, there is specific address and a specific description about women, believers, righteous women, women who have been commanded also to put or to do certain things, to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a specific way, or to stay away from some specific things. We can say that all of those are descriptions and aspects of what makes a successful Muslim woman. So, an example of the general description of the believers that should be true of the believing woman as well as the man is the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Mu'minun, where He said, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ خَاشِعُونَ وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنِ اللَّغْوِ مُعْرِضُونَ وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِلزَّكَاةِ فَاعِلُونَ وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ إِلَّا عَلَى أَزْوَاجِهِمْ أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُمْ فَإِنَّهُمْ غَيْرُ مَلُومِينَ فَمَنِ ابْتَغَى وَرَاءَ ذَلِكَ فَأُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْعَادُونَ وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِأَمَانَاتِهِمْ وَعَهْدِهِمْ رَاعُونَ وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَلَى صَلَوَاتِهِمْ يُحَافِظُونَ أُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْوَارِثُونَ الَّذِينَ يَرِثُونَ الْفِرْدَوْسَ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. The believers have surely succeeded. Those who are khashi'un, who are humble and submissive in their salah, in their prayers, and those who turn away from ill speech or wasteful and false speech, and those who observe zakah, who give in charity, or according to some explanations of the scholars, this means who purify themselves, and those who guard their chastity, except from their wives or those that their right hands possess. For indeed such are not to be blamed. But whoever seeks beyond that, beyond the wife, beyond the right hand possession, then those are the transgressors. They have gone beyond the bounds.
And those believers who fulfill and who are attentive, careful about their trusts and their promises, and those who carefully maintain and look after their salah, their prayers, those are the inheritors who will inherit al-Firdaus, paradise. They will be there forever. So for a person who wants success in this life and in the hereafter, he or she should consider the description and the attributes, the qualities that are mentioned in such verses. Again, success has been linked to a person being a mu'min, being a believer. And then in this passage, these verses of the Noble Quran, some of the qualities of the believers are mentioned. The first of them is al-khushu' fi salah, to be humble or to have this quality of khushu' in one's salah, in one's prayers. And al-khushu' is to be humble and submissive and low in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in one's heart and physically, in the movement and in the settling of the limbs in the prayer. And this is really the soul and the heart of a person's salah. That when a person stands in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to pray, to establish the salah, then that person stands humbly and submissive in his heart and in his body, such that he thinks or she thinks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and about the adhkar, the remembrances that she is saying, what she is remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with. And she thinks about the meaning of what she is reciting, which makes her turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and perform this act of worship according to, or in the best way, and hoping to gain forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to get the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through worshipping Him. This should cause the person to pray with khushu' in one's limbs, to be still and humble in front of Allah, to concentrate on remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the prayer. And this khushu', this humbleness and submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the prayer is really the thing that a person benefits from and when he or she stands to pray. And this is the thing that really gives a benefit to a person and is the real purpose of the prayer, to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to submit the limbs and to submit one's body, to submit your whole self to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described the salah in the Quran, that the prayer is supposed to prohibit a person from al-fahisha. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, verily the prayer, the meaning in English, verily the prayer forbids or prohibits. And a lot of this is connected to the person's khushu' or their submission and submissiveness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in salah. The other thing that is mentioned here in the verse, or in the next verse, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنِ اللَّغْوِ مُعْرِضُونَ, those who turn away from false speech or ill speech. Al-lahu is everything, every type of speech that is not pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is batil, that is false, or that involves disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it involves things like speaking ill or speaking falsehood about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or His religion. It includes things like lying, backbiting and slandering others, singing, and all of those other types of speech or what a person might vocalize that involves disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it involves forgetting Allah or saying and vocalizing what displeases Allah Azza wa Jal. And this is something that the believer has to be very careful or very vigilant about. When you speak, is it something that pleases Allah Azza wa Jal, or is it something that displeases Allah? Are you wasting your speech on things which are false, things which displease Allah? And a very good piece of advice in this regard, as some of the early scholars from the Salaf mentioned, is that before you say anything, before you speak to your sister, before you speak to someone, before you vocalize anything, you should consider when that speech leaves your mouth, is it something that's going to draw you closer to Allah? Or is it going to be something that distances you further away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Is it something that will draw you closer to paradise, or is it something that's going to take you further to the fire? And we seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's refuge from that. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us that a person can say something which he gives no attention to. He doesn't think it's very important, he just says it. But because of it, that person will be thrown or will fall into Jahannam, into the fire, for a depth or a distance of 70 years. And a person might say something which he doesn't regard as he doesn't regard it as very great, but he pleases Allah by this statement, and that person through that may be given paradise, may be forgiven. So a person, one of the qualities of the believers is that they stay away from al-lahu, or false speech, batil, false speech, things that displease Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of what we vocalize. And our sisters need to pay attention to this. They need to be careful about what they say and how they speak to others and about others. And if we want to generalize, and sometimes it's true or it's beneficial to generalize, one of the things that many women have been tried with is false speech. Speech that involves disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and displeasing Allah Azza wa Jal. So, backbiting, slandering others, speaking indecently, speaking to males, speaking to men in an inappropriate manner, speaking and arguing and fighting with each other and cursing one another, or saying things which involve belittling your fellow sisters. These things have to be considered because they draw you away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they draw a person closer to Jahannam. These things are forbidden, and one of the worst kinds of sins, or some of the worst sins, are related to the sins of one's speech. Likewise, singing, and related to this, listening to singing and music. But singing oneself is a type of lahu, is a type of false speech. And as it was described by some of the Sahaba, that Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu ta'ala anhu It is something that causes nifaq, hypocrisy, to sprout in the heart. Just like water causes the herbs and plants to grow. In the same way, singing causes nifaq, hypocrisy, to grow in the heart, where a person appears in certain circumstances to be good, to be righteous, to be doing the right thing, but in reality in their heart the sinfulness and insincerity is growing. And this, as Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah said, is one of the best descriptions about singing. This description, companion and scholar said, singing sprouts or causes nifaq to grow in the heart. This is the reality of taking part in activities such as singing and music and so on. They have a very, very bad effect on the heart, the opposite of the Quran, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which are a shifa, a cure for what is in the hearts, a cure for a person's heart and a cure for a person's beliefs, a person's thinking, a person's attitudes, a person's behavior. These two things are opposite to each other. Loving the Quran and giving importance to the Quran, and loving music and singing. And the first is the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran. Whereas singing has been described as the Quran of the shaitan. Some of the Salaf, some of the ulama said, singing is the Quran of the shaitan. And the ulama mentioned that it is not possible for the love of the Quran, the love of the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the love of singing or song to combine within the heart of a person. These two things cannot coexist without one of them overcoming the other, without one of them being dominant over the other. If a person loves the Quran, loves the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then his or her time and effort are occupied with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they have no place, they have no attraction towards singing and towards music and so on and these related things. So the quality of the believer is that he or she turns away from al-laghu. This also includes turning away from listening to things which affect a person's attitude and a person's beliefs or a person's correct way of thinking as a Muslim. Like al-bid'ah, innovation and heresy in the deen, where people speak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala falsely, wrongly. They speak about the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala falsely, or they distort the religion of Allah, or they lie about Allah. They innovate new ideas and new ideologies into the deen. This is one of the worst types of lahu, of false speech, and the believer is required by his iman, by his religion and his faith, to turn away and not to partake in such type of speech. And this is one of the proofs, or one of the principles that establish the abandonment and disassociation from Ahlul Bid'ah, from the people of innovation, heretics, people who introduce new ideas and false practices, beliefs into the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the proofs, or one of the basis for this action, which is a righteous action, to turn away and to abandon the people of bid'ah, it lies in the fact that we also, as believers, have been commanded to turn away from false speech. Because a person who sits down and who listens, or who reads, or watches the people of bid'ah spread their innovation, that person has not turned away from false speech, rather they have joined in the false speech and taken part, and by being an audience, letting themselves hear that false speech. So this is another very important thing that in this day and age, we as Muslims, young Muslims, brothers and sisters, need to be very careful of. Who and what we open our ears to and what we let ourselves listen to. It's another challenge for a lot of our sisters, particularly those who are living in environments or living in circumstances in which they have to struggle to learn their religion, and they have to sift through a lot of different types, an array of different ideas, attitudes, beliefs, and speech about the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, they shouldn't have to sift through any of it. They should be sticking to what is correct or what is reliable in terms of the source, in terms of where it comes from. And so one of the challenges, or one of the things we've seen from many of the sisters is this willingness to listen and to read and to open their ears and their hearts to everything and anything that is said about the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now this is a very risky, a very dangerous way of trying to learn the religion or being interested in the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the heart is, if it's corrupted, if it's influenced by falsehood, then this will lead to destruction, and it will lead to a person's attitude, a person's actions, a person's beliefs, as well as their deeds becoming corrupt. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us that on Yawm al-Qiyamah, people will not benefit from their lives, except those who come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a sound, clean heart. إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. People will, on that day, on Yawm al-Qiyamah, when a person's family, their sons and their wealth will not benefit them, except those who come to Allah with a sound heart. Qalb Salim. And this sound heart is the heart which is free of kufr and shirk. It is clean of having unbelief or shirk, associating partners with Allah in it. And it is clean and pure of bid'ah and heresies, false beliefs, false attitudes, false ways of understanding the religion. And it is clear or clean of al-ma'asi, sins and disobedience, feelings and attitudes of disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when the heart is like this, then the rest of the body also follows on from the purity and the cleanness of the heart. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, أَلَا وَإِنَّ فِي الْجَسَدِ مُضْغَةً إِذَا صَلُحَتْ صَلَحَ الْجَسَدُ كُلُّهُ وَإِذَا فَسَدَتْ فَسَدَ الْجَسَدُ كُلُّهُ أَلَا وَهِيَ الْقَلْبُ. Indeed, in the body, there is a piece of flesh. If it is sound and whole, then the rest of the body will be sound and whole and healthy and correct. But if it is corrupted, the rest of the body will be corrupted in its actions, in its behavior. And that piece of flesh is the heart. So, what we see, what we look at, and what we listen to, these are the windows and the doors to the heart. And a person has to be very careful what they listen to and what they let into their hearts. One of the preventative measures, or one of the most important and best ways of protecting the heart, is to turn away from false speech. Turning away means not to be involved in it, not to listen to it, not to be close to the people who speak it, but to turn away and to move on and not to partake or not to make oneself an audience. One of the qualities that are mentioned here is وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِلزَّكَاةِ فَاعِلُونَ, those who observe az-zakah. Az-zakah originally means an-numu, growth, where something grows in a healthy way. And one of the conditions for growing in a healthy way is to be clean and pure. And that is why purity and cleanliness is expressed in the language of the book and the sunnah in Arabic as tazkiyah. Tazkiyah, which we translate as purification. Zakah comes from the same kind of the same root. And zakah, the wealth, the money that we give, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has favored us to have more than our needs, then we are required to give some of that wealth, a small percentage of that wealth, to the poor and the needy, those who deserve and who are eligible to receive this, as mentioned in the Quran. Zakah also comes in the language of the Quran and the Sunnah to mean purifying oneself. Zakah, which is the charity that we give, is called zakah because it causes a person's wealth, the blessings of it, to grow. That's the original meaning of zakah, is to grow. Because when a person gives from his own wealth in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sincerely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this actually causes that person's wealth and what they own to be more beneficial to him and to grow in blessings. Either by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving that person more wealth, or by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala putting blessings in the wealth that he has. And that is why the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, ما نقص صدقة من مال أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. The Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام said words to the effect, sadaqah never reduces a person's wealth. Sadaqah, charity, never reduces a person's wealth. We would think physically, if you look at it, you have wealth, you have some money, and you give some of that in charity. If you were to give some of that in charity, the obvious, or the thing that is immediately obvious, is that your wealth has decreased. But the reality is that your wealth has not decreased through charity. In fact, it gets more beneficial, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala purifies you through that charity and gives you blessings in that charity. Some of the scholars mention here that the meaning of zakah here also refers to purifying oneself by leaving sins, and by through the remembrance of Allah and through leaving off sins and disobedience to Allah, to purify oneself, because a person grows. A person is commanded to grow their soul, to develop it in a good way, and not to hold it back or to stunt it and to corrupt it through the disobedience of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about the people who will be successful, they are those who make zakah of their souls, which means they make their souls develop and grow
through being more obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning to make the soul obedient and to direct it towards obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to correct beliefs and correct attitudes and correct practice, then that soul can be described as having grown or having been developed and matured. The opposite is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا, and the one who stunts, corrupts and spoils his soul has lost. So these are some of the general verses about the sifat, qualities of the believers. Due to lack of time, I recommend that our sisters refer back to these verses in Surah Al-Mu'minun. These are the first 11 verses in Surah Al-Mu'minun. Refer back to them and ponder over them and learn what the ulama have mentioned about their meaning. Another set of verses that we can refer to in this regard are from Surah Al-Ahzab, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in Surah Al-Ahzab, verse 35, إِنَّ الْمُسْلِمِينَ وَالْمُسْلِمَاتِ وَالْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ وَالْقَانِتِينَ وَالْقَانِتَاتِ والصادقين والصادقات والصابرين والصابرات والخاشعين والخاشعات والمتصدقين والمتصدقات والصائمين والصائمات والحافظين فروجهم والحافظات والذاكرين الله كثيرا والذاكرات أعد الله لهم مغفرة وأجرا عظيما. Verily the Muslim men and the Muslim women, the believing men and the believing women, the devoutly obedient men and the devoutly obedient women, the truthful men and the truthful women, the patient and persevering men and the patient and persevering women, the humble and submissive men to Allah and the humble and submissive women, those who are humble and submissive, they have khushu' for Allah, and the men who give in charity for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the women who do the same, and those men who fast, and those women who fast, and those men who protect their chastity from falling into illegal sexual intercourse, and those women who protect their chastity, and those men who remember Allah much, and those women who remember Allah much, Allah has prepared for them and promised for them forgiveness and a great reward. These are also some of the qualities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described of successful women. They have those same fundamental qualities that men are supposed to have to be successful, that women are supposed to also have. We are the same in this regard. Submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Muslim, believing in correct iman, a correct aqidah, a correct belief system, a correct attitude, believing in all those things that we're supposed to believe in and not rejecting any of it, to have iman, to be devout, obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to have this qunut, to be qanit, which means to be devout, to put oneself to the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be truthful in one's beliefs, in one's speech, and in one's actions. This is one of the most important qualities. And actually the reality of truthfulness is not just to speak the truth. This is one aspect or one very important part of being truthful. As-sidq, truthfulness, begins by being true in one's heart and in one's actions. Meaning that when a person obeys Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala openly, they really mean it and they do it sincerely from the heart. Truthfulness in reality is to be the same on the inside as you are on the outside.
Truthfulness is to be the same on the inside as you are on the outside. This is the reality of truthfulness, and one part of that, and a very important part of that, is to always say the truth. When you speak, speak the truth. As-sabirin was-sabirat, those who are patient from the men and the women. As-sabr, patience, is to remain steadfast in obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Believing and trusting in the reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you and take care of you if you remain obedient to Him. That's the reality of patience. As-sabr has three aspects to it. The first is to steadfast, consistent upon the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to remain obedient to Allah, so that no matter what hardships you have or challenges you have, you don't allow yourself to do something or to leave obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You stay obedient to Allah. When you pray, you remain someone who prays regularly. When you obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a certain way, you try to make sure that you're always like this. You remain steadfast on this. This is the first pillar of patience. To remain obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second thing is to remain patient and consistent in staying away from sins, in staying away from the disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, when you leave and you abandon a sin for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be saved from Allah's anger and to be rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you stay like this. You maintain that, and you don't give up, or you don't allow yourself to fall back into disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the third pillar of sabr, of patience, is to remain steadfast and be patient in the face of what afflicts you, or what faces you, what Allah has written to occur to you in your life. Trouble, danger, poverty, stress, sadness, the loss of wealth, the loss of life, the loss of loved ones. Those calamities and problems that may afflict a person as a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The third pillar of sabr is to remain patient upon obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when faced with those hardships. This is also a very important quality of the successful woman, just as it is a quality of the successful man, the true believing man, or the true believing. So these are some of the qualities mentioned, and again, you can refer to those qualities and look at the meanings and the implications of those things that are mentioned. Included within that is guarding one's chastity, remaining steadfast in not letting oneself fall into what Allah has forbidden with regards to one's chastity, remaining steadfast. وَالْحَافِظِينَ فُرُوجَهُمْ وَالْحَافِظَاتِ, those who preserve or protect their chastity, the men preserve their chastity, and the women preserve their chastity. This requires that a Muslim woman has to implement, to be steadfast on those aspects of the rules and regulations